Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today we're unpacking what honestly might be the single most overlooked truth in modern education. Think about a typical classroom for a second. We spend an enormous amount of time, literally years, training students to answer questions correctly. We drill them, we test them, we grade them on their answers, but we rarely, if ever, teach them how to actually ask them. Yet, the students who truly thrive, they aren't the fastest memorizers. They're the ones who've built up these habits of curiosity and intellectual exploration. They know how to ask meaningful questions. So today, we're going to look at exactly how we can build that architecture of inquiry.
Okay, let's dive right into this. This quote from Confucius perfectly frames the stakes of our conversation today. By three methods, we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is the most bitter. You see, the ultimate goal of education isn't just about compliance with pacing guides or surviving standardized tests. The goal is wisdom, and wisdom absolutely requires reflection. It's a developmental journey. When students learn to question deeply, they become way more resilient, stronger critical thinkers, and honestly, far more intellectually courageous. Questioning is literally the engine of reflection.
Here's our cognitive map for the Explainer today. We'll start with the crisis of compliance, look at the anatomy of student silence, explore three types of questions, dig into frameworks for deep inquiry, and finally, cultivating a questioning culture. Let's get going.
Section 1. The Crisis of Compliance.
We really need to look at this with a sense of urgency, because real learning begins with uncertainty. But man, look at this stark contrast. Modern classrooms unintentionally train students into this passive loop, right? Wait, comply, consume, and repeat. We're churning out dependent learners who can absolutely ace a worksheet, but they just freeze in a complete panic when asked to think independently. But step outside the school building. Scientists, inventors, journalists, they rely entirely on questioning just to survive. There is a massive disconnect here.
And you know what's really frustrating? We've known this for a long time. Way back in 1975, Catherine Kornblith conducted his foundational research on student questioning, and she warned us that school environments heavily suppress inquiry by rewarding passive listening, worksheet completion, and teacher-dominated discourse. We've been so overly focused on how well the teacher asks questions that we're completely ignoring the enormous cognitive power of student-generated inquiry. Decades later, and we are still fighting this exact same battle. Moving into Section 2, the anatomy of student silence.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that if questioning is the engine of learning, then the absence of questioning isn't a sign of good behavior. It's a blaring warning sign. When a student sits silently, you have to look at the psychological barriers stacked against them. It's almost never because they don't have questions. It's fear of embarrassment. It's a lack of the right language structures to even articulate what they're confused about. Or it's learned helplessness from years of being conditioned to believe that school is just a compliance exercise. When they sit silently, we lose absolutely all visibility into their cognitive gaps.
Okay, Section 3, three types of questions. The first category isn't even a question at all. It's the questions never asked. And this is the most dangerous state. This happens when students actively hide their cognitive gaps. They might mask their confusion by nodding along, or they avoid intellectual risk entirely because they lack the background knowledge and just don't want to be exposed. This is that silence we just talked about, and it is absolutely the enemy of learning.
The second tier is what we call the get-it-done questions. Now, this is definitely a step up from silence, but it's purely procedural. It's a student asking, is this enough? Or can I turn this in now? These are really low-level, permission-seeking questions. They don't indicate curiosity at all. They just serve the illusion of learning. The student is simply trying to clear the hurdle of the assignment and move on. And finally, we reach the summit, the transformative questions. These are driven by genuine intellectual curiosity. This is when a student actually leans in and asks, hey, why did the author structure it this way? Or could there be another solution to this problem? These are the questions that lead to really deep understanding. Our entire mission as educators has to be moving students from that first stage of silence and compliance all the way up to this transformative tier. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into frameworks for deep inquiry. So, now that we've diagnosed the problem, we really need to equip you with strategies to fix it because, let's face it, questioning is not always intuitive.
One of the absolute best tools for this is the reciprocal questioning process. It dramatically shifts the classroom from teacher-centered delivery to student-centered dialogue. Students work collaboratively to summarize, clarify, predict, illustrate, and generate questions. Step by step, they actually begin to internalize the invisible thinking processes of expert learners. It's truly amazing to see. But to help them generate those questions, we have to give them the vocabulary first. This matrix of question stems is incredibly powerful. We explicitly teach students these 4 tiers. Clarifying stems like, what does this mean? Analytical stems such as, why did the author choose this? Evaluative stems like, whose perspective is missing here? And my personal favorite, creative stems. What if the exact opposite happened? Giving students direct instruction in these stems builds powerful, lasting thinking structures in their minds. It gives them the scaffolding they need to finally take those intellectual risks.
Bringing us to Section 5, cultivating a questioning culture. So, the crucial point is this. You can have the best frameworks in the entire world, but they will totally fail if you don't have an environment built on psychological safety. Building that culture requires really intentional practice. You have to visibly model curiosity daily. Normalize productive struggle. Praise the messy process of thinking over just getting the right answer. And perhaps the most difficult practice of all? Using wait time. When you ask a deep question, you literally have to stop talking. Just let them process. Let that uncomfortable silence sit there in the room. Let students lead those discussions. Because that pause, that's where the magic lifts. The impact of this culture shift is massive, especially when we look at the science of reading. Active questioning is deeply, intrinsically connected to comprehension. When students actively question a text, they are constantly monitoring their own understanding and repairing breakdowns in real time, inferring meaning and connecting ideas. This questioning routine is absolutely transformative, particularly for dyslexic learners, multilingual learners, and those with weak background knowledge. It literally turns reading from a passive chore into an active process of meaning-making. It's a real game changer. Which brings us to the core thesis of this explainer. The ultimate purpose of education isn't simply the transfer of information. I mean, if it were, an internet connection would be enough, right? The purpose of education is the development of thoughtful, intellectually courageous human beings. People capable of empathy, discernment, and wisdom. The classrooms that truly change lives are the ones where students feel safe enough to wonder aloud. As this quote beautifully states, the greatest teachers do more than deliver answers. They help students become question askers, because once they do, real learning begins. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on. Take a second to really visualize this in your own context. What would happen tomorrow if your classroom rewarded questions instead of answers? How would the energy shift? How would the students change? Thank you so much for exploring this architecture of inquiry with us, and keep asking the big questions.